Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Harry Sekulich.
I'm Emma Gillespie.
Working from home at least 2 days a week could become a legal right in Victoria. The state government has laid out plans to make it an entitlement to public and private sector workers. Premier Jacinta Allan said it could boost business productivity and help workers with caring responsibilities. But some critics have questioned how it would work, including whether it would even be lawful in Australia.
Harry, we are talking about some legislation that is being tabled in Victoria to make it a protected law for workers to have 2 days a week where they can work from home. Work from home has been a debate in workplaces around the country and the world really ever since kind of COVID erupted and changed the way we think about work and remote work. It's definitely a debate that we have seen a lot of scrutiny, a lot of for and against, but it's the first time this week that we're seeing it really potentially being discussed as a legal right. What can you tell us about how this would all work?
Yeah, you're so right. There's always this ebb and flow from the periphery to the centre when it comes to working from home and how workplaces are kind of dealing with it. Mm-hmm. So over the weekend, the Victorian government brought it right back into the centre again, and they announced that it was going to legislate a right to work from home at least 2 days a week. Now, to give it a bit of context, the right would apply in circumstances where it's considered reasonable. Mm-hmm. So it wouldn't have universal coverage. If you think about some workplaces, like nurses need to be in a hospital, teachers need to be in a classroom. If there's a fire, firefighters have to go and put out the flames, right?
Yeah.
So it wouldn't necessarily have coverage right across the board.
Okay, so reasonable can basically be interpreted in terms of, is your job a job that can be done from home?
That's right. And I think that's where it's helpful to think of office work. Mm-hmm. This is essentially where it's likely to apply most. That's because the proposal focuses on workers who, in circumstances where it would be considered reasonable, they wouldn't have to negotiate working from home 2 days a week. Basically, their boss wouldn't be able to deny them this option under the legislation.
Okay.
I think it's important to add as well that this is a government announcement, but it would apply to both the public and private sector. Mm-hmm. So if you worked for an insurance firm, if you worked for a public agency, it wouldn't really matter. If you do work in an office, if the circumstances allow for it, you would be covered by this right. And we're at a very early stage of this legislation as well. It actually hasn't been drafted yet. Mm-hmm. What the government's doing now is it's announced that it plans to do this. It'll go through a consultation process. It'll define things like what actually counts as remote work. And then it plans to legislate this right in 2026.
Okay, got it. I find it really interesting that we're talking about legislating this working from home arrangement for Victorians because by now, we're all well and truly versed in the post-COVID remote work landscape, I suppose. And that means that a lot of workplaces, a lot of private sector companies as well, have already kind of rolled out their own strategies, their own plans. A lot of businesses have clear-cut rules about, okay, yep, you can work X amount of days or hours from home, but you have to be in the office for this many face-to-face days, or they've completely kind of ruled out working from home. So why is there a need to bring it into law? Why now?
Yeah, it's definitely not a niche thing to work from home. The Australian Bureau of Statistics data actually shows it's about 36% of people in Australia work from home at least once a week.
Wow.
So if it is kind of common, why would you need legislation? Well, basically it would give workers quite a powerful tool to say, you can't deny me the option to work from home. It's actually illegal to deny me that right. Mm. It would also make working from home rules a bit more consistent in Victoria. It wouldn't vary by an award. It wouldn't vary by workplace. It would just remove the need for there to be any sort of dialogue between an employer and employee as currently exists in the workplace laws. And if you think about some workplaces, some big employers in Australia, the big four banks require their workers to work in the office at least half of a given month. They measure it by a month.
That's interesting because I was thinking about, if you are a national company, if you're an Australia-wide employer, how this legislation would potentially work for you if you've got some staff in Victoria on a different set of rules than everywhere else in the country. But if it's a 50-50 thing, then the 2-day-a-week legislation wouldn't really impact that. But it is certainly interesting kind of on the other side of, I feel like we've seen a bit of I don't want to say an overcorrection, but I think companies have anecdotally become more conservative about working from home in recent years.
I definitely want to get into the reasons why some businesses oppose this idea, but unions have been raising the concerns about employers denying their staff the right to work from home. In fact, the Australian Services Union, which joined the Victorian government in announcing this measure, they have a dedicated campaign to helping workers understand flexible working rights. So when the Victorian Premier, Jacinta Allan, was asked about why there needed to be a legally enshrined right, I thought it was quite interesting that she mentioned people with caring responsibilities and young families. Here's a little bit of what she had to say.
It works for families, particularly for women, for single mums, for people with caring responsibilities. And there's plenty of men too who face those pressures and challenges of those caring and family responsibilities.
Okay, so just to recap quickly, Harry, Victoria's Labor government, led by Premier Jacinta Allan, has announced a plan to legislate the right to work from home 2 days a week for reasonable workers or in circumstances where your job permits that. What has the opposition had to say about this? Have we heard from them?
Yeah, so I also think it's significant that Victoria goes to an election next year and the government plans to legislate it next year as well. So it's reasonable to ask, if the opposition gets into power, will they just scrap this right altogether? And so the opposition leader, Brad Batten, was asked about this over the weekend. He said there are still a few questions and a few loose ends to tie up when it comes to legislating a working from home right, but otherwise the state coalition generally supports the measure.
I think the opportunity to have that discussion and there's negotiations between employers and employees is really important, and hybrid working is part of the future.
That's really interesting because I'm sure we're going to talk about this, but that is the Victorian Coalition's position, which sounds a little bit different from the Federal Coalition's position just a few months ago.
Yeah. Remember in the federal election, we had this massive debate about working from home because the then leader of the Federal Coalition, Peter Dutton, had announced this policy to require all Australian public sector workers to work in the office 5 days a week. Now, he later scrapped those plans. There was a lot of pushback to it. He apologised and he actually admitted that the coalition got it wrong on that one. So this is an issue that is looming large over the coalition, and I think Brad Batten definitely has that in mind when he's consulting on these changes and looking at whether he would adopt that policy as well. Okay. He doesn't seem to want to go there.
Okay, so it seems like the Victorian Coalition has learned from the potential missteps of the Federal Coalition and aren't looking to kind of repeat that debate that we had at a federal level. I
think that's fair to say. He was pretty quick to sort of water that down, saying, well, look, we just won't tinker with it if it comes into effect as legislation.
Okay.
And generally supports the idea of a hybrid work model.
So, Harry, what is the argument against working from home? Why have we seen a bit of a movement here led by politicians and businesses in some sectors pushing back against it, saying, no, we don't want you working from home. We want you in the office 5 days a week?
I think you can categorise it into two main sets of arguments. The first one comes to this idea of a two-tiered workforce, those who can work from home and those who can't. So if you think about a hospital, for instance, nurses can't work from home. They have to directly help patients. But if you think about some of the administrative staff at a hospital, they could work from home.
Okay.
Just on a logistical basis, how that would work case by case, obviously we won't get into that. But I think some of the questions here are, that's one entitlement for one section of the workforce, but then that leaves the others out.
Okay, so it's a question of, is it fair to split those workforces maybe into a hierarchy of you can and you can't?
That's right. And Jacinta Allan was asked about this, and she kind of brushed off this suggestion, saying that this is already occurring in the workplace. I go back to that figure from the ABS, 36% of people in Australia already working from home.
More than 1 in 3.
That's right. And so some offices might require you to come into the office more frequently just based on the nature of work. Think about us, Emma. We're here in the studio today recording a podcast. It's harder to do that from home.
Yeah.
It just also wouldn't sound as good or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
But that's just us in that unique circumstance. Some other jobs require you to travel. So, you know, there's a whole host of different workplace arrangements. So it wouldn't necessarily create a second tier when there's already hybrid work across the board. That's Jacinta Allan's argument, I should hasten to add.
And I think there are a lot of workers who can't, for whatever reason, work from home, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't want other people to have the freedom or the flexibility. You know, us, for example, we love being here and being on the mic to do the podcast. That doesn't mean that I don't want other people to be able to work from home and enjoy the luxuries that we can't.
Yeah, the envy of other people's rights.
It also means, though, like, you know, I know that we have a really great internet connection here to do this stuff, and sometimes at home it's not always as reliable.
It'll crash and burn.
Yeah, I'll embarrass myself on a Zoom call. I'll get frozen in an awkward position. That's a stress of working from home.
Exactly. So that's one area that's been argued. The second main argument that's been put forward is the economic impact. So if you think about the CBD in whatever city, whatever state you might be in Australia, if you have office workers going in less regularly, well, that's less business for cafes, for restaurants who would otherwise see these workers come in more frequently. And so there's a bit less economic activity, if you like. That's the broader argument. Once again, Jacinta Allan was asked about this. She said that financially for individual workers, they'll end up better off if they have a right to work from home because they won't have to spend on commuting, so getting public transport or parking in the CBD, which we know can be really expensive. And also they won't have to, you know, fuel up as much and their hip pocket will improve. So in turn, they might actually end up spending more money going out and buying dinner or going out to lunch or something.
There's also, I think, an economic argument for the rural-urban spread that we've seen in the last few years. Of course, there's more vacant spaces in office CBDs, but more people are moving to the regions. There's been a huge spike in the property economy in kind of regional and rural communities that sit outside of those major CBDs where workers otherwise wouldn't have been able to imagine themselves relocating to and keeping their job. But now they are living in these kinds of areas where maybe it's a 1 or a 2 hour drive from the office, but they make that commitment to be there once or twice a week.
And the commuter belt for our main cities is just getting wider and wider and wider and more expansive. So people are actually opting to live a little bit further out of the city so they don't have to commute into work 5 days a week necessarily, but might only have to do it 3 or 4 days a week.
And what about the productivity argument? Is there concern that working from home is bad for productivity, good for productivity? What's been said there?
Hey, I'm Harry. I'm the political journalist here at the Daily Aus. If you like this video, you can subscribe so that you don't miss any of our future ones and you can see more about great stuff. Now, back to the deep dive. The government has said that productivity won't suffer as a result. In fact, they've pointed to some studies that already show that workers tend to be a little bit more productive, get a bit more out of their day when they're able to work from home and have those hybrid arrangements in place. So look, there's always going to be a bit of back and forth. There will be some people that disagree, some people that agree.
There's the whole social argument, face-to-face interactions versus the isolation of working from home. So much that has been discussed and will continue to be discussed, Harry. But have we heard from businesses themselves? It obviously will be on them to adjust to this change if Victoria legislates the right to work from home. What are business groups saying?
So they're pretty concerned about the legislation and how it would work in effect. Because, as you said, they would have to adjust to these changes. And we've heard from the Victorian head of the Australian Industry Group, Tim Piper. He released a statement over the weekend calling the measure, quote, political theatre. In other words, might seem popular but doesn't achieve much, in his view. He added, what works for one company may not suit another. Flexible work should be driven by the needs of individual businesses. Piper also raised what I think is a really important issue, and you touched on it briefly before, and I want to come back to it because it does have broader national implications. The way that work is governed in Australia is overseen by what's known as the Fair Work Commission, which is our workplace referee right across the country.
Yep.
There's no right to work from home as clear as that in the national legislation.
Okay.
But if Victoria decides to bring this in, it could create actually a bit of a constitutional issue.
Right, because you're saying that the Fair Work Commission is the national regulator for workplace disputes or workers' rights. And if we have a state saying this is a set of rules that might contradict their set of rules, that could create problems.
Yeah, and the way that our constitution works as well is that if there is a conflict directly between a state and federal law, the federal law trumps the state law.
Interesting.
So it might actually not end up having the legislative effect that the government wants it to.
Wow.
Which is that you would get this legal right 2 days a week if there's no federal legislation to back it in.
Has Labor, either at the state or national level, commented on what that might mean? If this is all kind of going to be overridden by a lack of legislation federally, does that mean that the Albanese government's going to look at something like this?
We don't know if the government at a federal level is going to look into it. In fact, the Workplace Relations Minister, Amanda Rishworth, has been asked, and I've been in touch with her team. There's no plans at this stage, and they aren't exactly willing to comment on it either because they just might not see it as appropriate given that it is a Victorian issue. But the state government said that that's why it's going through consultation right now, because it wants to look at these potential challenges that could come out of their legislation. And so they want to anticipate that there might be a High Court challenge down the track if, say, there is a conflict at a state and federal level. But I think you actually touched on something that was even more basic. We have national companies in Australia that employ people in every city, in every state. If one state has rights that other states don't get, you might actually see a little bit of that grievance trickle through the workforce. And so that causes a few issues when it comes to these national companies trying to just create a good workplace for everyone, but then Victoria can, anyone working in Victoria can basically just say, look, I've got a right, don't really care about my interstate colleagues, but this is my legal right to have a two day a week working from home entitlement.
Fascinating. And then, of course, it could go the other way where national companies say, well, if Victorian employees can have 2 days a week from home, all employees can. And then if you've got all these big sectors and big names and brands doing that, then maybe there will be an imperative for the Fair Work Commission to undergo a bit of an overhaul.
Well, exactly. And I think ultimately, the fact that we're ending on some of these thornier, prickly issues with this potential legislation just shows that this debate is so far from over. We are going to be talking about it again. We are going to keep it in the centre, not in the periphery. And I think that it'll just be so fascinating to see how this consultation plays out, what the legislation actually looks like when it comes into being.
Yeah, very fascinating stuff. As you mentioned, Harry, we're expecting legislation to be tabled next year. Is that right?
Yep, 2026, before the election in Victoria next year. So we'll be keeping a close eye on it. I will be asking Jacinta Allan's team for more details as they come to hand and bring them to our audience here at the Daily Aus.
So interesting, Harry. Thank you, as always, for taking us through a pretty complicated one in really simple terms.
Oh, thanks, Emma.
And thank you for listening to today's episode, or if you're watching over on YouTube, hi, thank you. Don't forget to subscribe. We will be back a little bit later on today with your evening news headlines, but until then, have a good day.